Today's lecture, we are going to talk about the cranial nerves. They're also part of the nervous system, and they arise from various locations within the brain, but I had to wait till we went over all of these structures before we can talk about these nerves. They are also part of the peripheral nervous system. There is a great chart in your lab activity that has all of the information. Like, you will need to fill out that chart, and then once you do, you will have all the information you need in that chart to be able to answer questions that are on the exam. Ultimately, you will be responsible for learning that entire chart and all the information. So I'm going to lay out in this lecture what you need to know to fill out that chart. I will also go over the chart in lab so that we are all clear on the information that you need to memorize for the exam. Cranial nerves are important clinically, and you will see this pretty much anywhere you end up in healthcare. All right, so let's talk about these cranial nerves, give a little bit of an introduction. So these are nerves which arise from the brain and the brainstem rather than the spinal cord, okay? There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves that passage through different foramina within the skull. And now that you know the features of those skull bones, all of these foramina should make sense to you. And they're going to pass either individually or in groups. The cranial nerves are traditionally referred to using Roman numerals. So if you don't remember your Roman numerals, you will have to review that, because you must, whenever you write out a cranial nerve, you must use the Roman numeral. You can't just say, so they're like cranial nerve, you can't say 1, 2. You can't do that. They're actually numbered as in cranial nerves or Roman numerals, and I have that outlined on the slides. So again, you may need to review your Roman numerals, but that is the standard nomenclature. It would be marked wrong if you used regular numbers, okay? And the functions of these cranial nerves are either going to be sensory information, motor information, or some of these nerves actually carry both. There is a mnemonic here that I put. There's actually another mnemonic that another instructor was telling me about. I'll have to look it up, but it has something to do, if you do look it up, there's velvet in one of the words instead of vacations. I can't remember. You may need to come up with a mnemonic. I will tell you, though, it might seem overwhelming when I originally go through this information, but when you lay out the information in the chart, in the lab activity, you will see lots of patterns, and you can memorize those patterns once you have it written out. All right, so these are the nerves that I'm going to go over, and let us get started. Okay, so first of all, it's also important to remind yourself, and this has been a theme throughout the nervous system, that it is imperative that you understand the differences between somatic motor, somatic sensory, visceral motor, and visceral sensory. So you must have a really good understanding of these. So remember, somatic motor has to do with skeletal muscle. These are muscles that we can control. Somatic sensory has to do with our senses that we are aware of: smell, taste, touch, etc. And then we have this branch here of visceral motor. These are things that we do not have control over. So this is such things like smooth muscle and cardiac muscle and glands. And then there's visceral sensory, which again, we've touched on this in multiple lectures now. And this has to do with, gas content like carbon dioxide and oxygen levels, pH levels. So you really need to have this foundation to be able to understand the role of the cranial nerves. Okay, so in this diagram, it is showing you the inferior view of the brain. All right, so we have the cerebrum here. You can see, you can't really see the midbrain, but you can kind of see it tucked in there. The midbrain is buried deep. You can see the pons here, right? And then the medulla oblongata is here, and that goes into the spinal cord. These cranial nerves are all originating on this inferior surface in various locations. So there are going to be some cranial nerves that come from the cerebrum, some come from the midbrain, some come from the pons, and then some are coming off of the medulla oblongata. And I'll show you that as we progress through these cranial nerves. So this diagram is also showing you, it's outlining each of these cranial nerves. So the olfactory nerve, the optic nerve. Again, I'm going to go over all of these. It's showing you the location from which the nerve is going to arise from. I don't want you to memorize this in particular diagram. I just want to give you a sense of how these cranial nerves are emerging from various parts of the brain. All right, so we're going to start by going through each and every one of the nerves, and my goal is to give you all the information you need to fill out that chart in the lab activity. Again, after you fill it out and in lab, I will write the entire chart on the board so that we can all be sure that you have all of the information. The first cranial nerve is called the olfactory nerve. This nerve has sensory information going through it. It is somatic sensory. It is the nerve of smell, okay? This nerve is going to originate at the cerebrum. So it is, if you remember that inferior view, it's that top, the very first superior nerve. It is going to, and again, all the information is going to come back together that we've learned from bones. That nerve is going to leave the cerebrum, and it is going to pass through the olfactory foramina of the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. That is the first cranial nerve. The second cranial nerve is the optic nerve. This is a sensory nerve. It is going to carry information from our eyes. This is the nerve of vision. So all of the visual information is going to travel through this nerve. This nerve also originates at the cerebrum, and it passes through the optic canal. Do you remember the optic canal and where that was in the sphenoid bone? That is the optic nerve. The third cranial nerve is called the oculomotor nerve. This is our first motor nerve, okay, and it's kind of has that in its name, oculomotor. It is a somatic motor nerve, and it's going to innervate 4 of the extrinsic eye muscles. And we'll talk a little bit more about the muscles of the eye when we get to vision. But this allows our eye to move in various directions. That's what these muscles are allowing us to do. Move our eyes up and down, left and right. This nerve originates at the midbrain, and it passes through the superior orbital fissure. Do you remember the superior orbital fissure of the sphenoid bone? So it's going to, you can see how it is originating here at the midbrain. It's going to pass through that whole, that fissure in the sphenoid bone, and it's going to innervate those muscles of the eye. That is the oculomotor nerve. The fourth cranial nerve is called the trochlear nerve. This is also a motor nerve. It has somatic motor information. It is also going to innervate some of the eye muscles, okay? You don't really need to memorize which muscles, just that they are eye muscles. All right, it's also going to originate in that midbrain area. You can see that here. And it too passes through the superior orbital fissure. So that is the trochlear nerve. That is cranial nerve number 4. And you can see the Roman numeral there. All right, the 5th cranial nerve is called the trigeminal nerve. Now this is going to be our first mixed nerve, which means it's going to have sensory and motor information from this nerve. So it's going to have somatic sensory information because it's going to innervate into the face. So you can kind of see that what's happening there. We're going to get sensation on our face. That is going to be transmitted by the trigeminal nerve. And it also carries somatic motor information. So it's going to innervate the chewing muscles. You remember our lateral and medial pterygoid muscles. The trigeminal nerve innervates these muscles, okay? So it has 2 functions that you need to know. It is a mixed nerve. It originates at the pons. You remember the pons, and it passes through the superior orbital fissure as well. And you remember the superior orbital fissure and how, big it was when you looked at the sphenoid bone, and that was to be able to hold all of these different nerves, to accommodate these different nerves. That's the word I was looking for. All right, the 6th cranial nerve is called the abducens nerve. This is a motor nerve, and it has somatic motor information running through it. It is also going to innervate one of the eye muscles. So there's a lot of eye muscles that help our eye move in various directions. All right, so again, I don't need you to know what muscle per se it's innervating. We'll come back to those muscles and what they do when we talk about vision, but just that it's involved in eye movement and eye muscles. This nerve, the abducens nerve, originates at the pons. You can see that here. And it is also passing through the superior orbital fissure. So again, once you see all of this in a chart format, you're going to see a lot of patterns. And those patterns are what is going to allow you to memorize this better. I believe that once you see it, you'll see what I'm referring to. All right, the 7th cranial nerve is called the facial nerve. This is a mixed nerve, so it's going to carry both motor and sensory information, but it carries quite a bit of information. So let's work through that. So it has some somatic motor information. It's going to innervate the muscles of facial expression. You remember that we talked about these muscles of facial expression. So we need nerves to innervate those so that we can move those muscles. There is also some visceral motor activity. So this particular nerve is going to innervate the lacrimal and salivary glands. So the lacrimal gland is responsible for tears. The salivary gland is responsible for making salivary enzymes. And then finally, it's going to have somatic sensory information as well. It is going to innervate the anterior 2/3 of our tongue. So that means that this nerve is going to be responsible for recognizing some of the taste that occurs on the tongue. So this nerve kind of does a lot. It originates at the pons, so you can see that here, and it is going to pass through the internal acoustic meatus. Do you remember that canal? That's where it's going to pass through. Once it passes through that canal, it is going to make a series of branches so that it can innervate all of those tissues that I just went over. All right, this is showing you some of those branches that are happening once it passes through that internal acoustic meatus. You get several branches of that nerve to innervate various places along our face. All right, the 8th cranial nerve is called the vestibulocochlear nerve. This nerve has sensory information passing through it. It is somatic sensory, so it is involved in hearing and balance. So this nerve originates at the pons, which is what is showing you right here. It is also passing through the internal acoustic meatus and going to various places in our ear. This nerve is going to transmit the things that we hear. All right, the 9th cranial nerve is called the glossopharyngeal nerve. And this nerve does have a lot of functions. It is a mixed nerve. Anytime you have a mixed nerve, there's going to be a lot of functions. So let's work through this. So there is some somatic sensory information. So it's going to innervate the posterior part of the tongue for taste. There is some visceral motor, and that nerve is innervating into the parotid salivary gland. All right, the parotid salivary gland, that's one of several salivary glands that we have that help with digestion. There is also somatic motor innervation, and this nerve is going to innervate into the pharynx. That's in the back of our throat, and that is going to allow us to swallow. And then finally, there is some visceral sensory information being detected by this nerve. It is going to detect blood pressure. So this nerve has a lot of functions. It originates at the medulla oblongata. So we're kind of moving down from the cerebrum to the midbrain to the pons, and now we're down to the medulla oblongata. It is going to pass through the jugular foramen because it needs to get to various places outside of the skull. The 10th cranial nerve is the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve does a lot. So let's talk about all of the things that the vagus nerve is doing. It is also a mixed nerve. So we know if it's a mixed nerve, it's going to be doing a lot. So it has some somatic motor functions. It is going to innervate some of the muscles of the pharynx to allow us to swallow. And it's also going to innervate parts of the larynx for vocalization or speaking. There is some visceral motor function, so it's going to innervate the heart, the lungs, the digestive tract. Really, this is one of those nerves, like what is it not doing? It does have some somatic sensory information too from the pharynx, the larynx, as well as hearing. And then we have visceral sensory information coming from this nerve because it is going to innervate some of the organs of the thoracic and abdominal cavities. So you'll have to come up with some kind of shorthand to remember all of these. I would break it down, and I think it's broken down in your lab activity where you can do somatic motor, visceral motor, somatic sensory, and somatic motor. So that's what that's referring to when you see it in the lab manual, and you can kind of write those things out. This nerve is also originating at the medulla oblongata, and it is passing through the jugular foramen because it needs to leave the skull to innervate some of these other organs. All right, let's work on the last two nerves. The 11th cranial nerve is called the accessory nerve. It has motor functions, specifically somatic motor. It is going to innervate some of the muscles of the neck that we went over in Unit 2, such as the sternocleidomastoid, the trapezius, and some of the muscles of the larynx and the pharynx. This nerve originates in the medulla oblongata, and it also passes through the jugular foramen, right? Because if it has to leave the skull, it needs to pass through one of these foramens to head down to some of these muscles. The last nerve, the 12th cranial nerve, is the hypoglossal nerve. This is involved in motor information, somatic motor. It is involved in tongue movement. It also originates at the medulla oblongata, and this nerve passes through the hypoglossal canal to get to those tongue muscles. I've also included in this lecture, but I'm not going to go over some of these images to help you with the brain dissection. To study from. We will, of course, have gone over these in lab, but these are just here. I put them in here, some nice labeled images to help you when you go on to study for the nervous system. All right, various pictures of dissected brains. All right, this concludes the cranial nerve lecture.